My family sometimes likes to try and annoy me when I'm playing The Legend of Zelda by coming up and going, "Oh, is that Zelda?" Well, now I can finally say yes, because Nintendo's Better Princess finally has her own game, with The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom. This latest entry in the Legend of Zelda series came as a complete surprise, because I don't think anybody was expecting it to be in that amazing Nintendo Direct. And the fact that it came out within just a few months of the announcement was so good. Now, despite how good Nintendo is making the trailers look, I still had quite a few concerns about this game leading up to the release. Would the new abilities feel natural to use? How would the combat be handled? How could Nintendo integrate the gameplay styles of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom into a top-down Zelda? And these concerns were still in my mind when the game showed up on my front porch. So I'd like to think that I probably went into this game with a bit more of a critical eye than most people. Before I get started, if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and consider subscribing. And also, fair warning, there will be a lot of major spoilers for this game. And now, let's take a look at The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom. The story begins with you playing as Link. He's already in the middle of an adventure in a dungeon full of Darknuts. You quickly come across Ganon, who has Princess Zelda trapped in a crystal. After a surprisingly easy fight, Link prepares to rescue Zelda when a strange rift suddenly starts spreading from the tip of Ganon's trident. Acting quickly as he's pulled into the rift, Link shoots an arrow at the crystal to free Zelda. With Link now gone, Zelda makes her way out of the dungeon and returns to the castle. There we learn that rifts have been appearing all across Hyrule for some time now, and people are getting pulled in. While Zelda is talking to her father, the king, a rift opens in the throne room and swallows up the king, general right, and minister left. Moments later, imposters pretending to be the king, general, and minister emerge and arrest Zelda. While in the dungeon of the castle, Zelda meets a strange fairy-like creature called Tri. Tri is responsible for closing the rifts. Tri gives Zelda a magic rod that can create echoes of objects. Using this new power, Zelda and Tri escape the dungeon and begin their quest to rescue the king and Link, close the rifts, and restore peace to Hyrule. Really, it's not a bad story, as Link getting captured at the end of his own quest I think is just such a cool twist. We do get a little more information later in the game about Tri. The Tri are a species normally invisible to the inhabitants of Hyrule that were created by the Golden Goddesses. Before the Golden Goddesses created the world, there was a great entity called Null who thrived on voids and nothingness. The goddesses created the world to contain Null, but he started making rifts appear all around, attempting to consume everything. So the goddesses set the Tri the task of closing the rifts as they opened. Now, this part of the story really bothers me, as it actually breaks a lot of lore. There was never a mention of rifts like this anywhere else in the series before this. And prior to this, it's stated that Demise was the source of all evil in Hyrule. So was Demise created by Null, or are they two separate evil entities? It's not explained, and it's really confusing, honestly. It's revealed partway through the game that Null's ultimate goal is to capture the Prime Energy. Now, what is the Prime Energy, you may ask? Well, it's revealed to be the Triforce. And now this just really pissed me off. Like, why the heck did Nintendo rename the Triforce? Why couldn't they just call it the Triforce? Calling it the Prime Energy sounds stupid, as that title doesn't really even fit with the theming of the series in my opinion. There was literally no reason for them to call it that in this game, as what they called the Triforce has literally no effect on the story. I mean, the word Triforce isn't even in the game. The only reason I can think of why Nintendo might change the name is so that it wouldn't be associated with Tri, which if that's the reason they changed the name, that's really dumb. Partly because they could have just named Tri something else, but also from a lore point of view, it actually would make sense for the names to be similar, Triforce, Tri, because they were both created by the Golden Goddesses. So it would be okay for the names to be similar. Alright, rant over, on with the review. Now, seeing as you play as Zelda instead of Link in this game, it makes sense that the gameplay style should be very different, and boy is it. Zelda's primary method of solving puzzles and fighting enemies is through echoes, which are basically just copies of objects and enemies you find throughout the world. Once you learn an echo, you can use the Tri-Rod to spawn it into the world. Basically, all of the game's puzzles involve using echoes in some way. Sometimes you need to make an echo of a fire enemy or a torch to burn a spiderweb, or use echoes of beds to build a bridge. Even navigating the world involves using echoes. In total, there are 127 echoes to learn throughout the game. Yeah, that's a lot. And since there are so many, there are usually a bunch of different ways to solve puzzles. This is a lot like Tears of the Kingdom in that way, since you don't have to do everything one specific way. Interestingly, the fact that there are so many echoes in the game is also actually a negative in my mind. There are literally too many, so that it becomes a hassle to find some of them in the menu after a while. And there are a lot that I only used once or twice, or didn't even use at all. This was especially true after getting the water block. It just made navigating the world completely trivial, and it became my go-to echo. Besides the echoes, there are also the automatons. These are mechanical, wind-up versions of some of the monsters. They're made by Dampe and has special abilities that make them stronger than regular echoes. However, I never used them. I just felt they were kinda pointless, so I never bothered with them. Echoes of Wisdom has brought the cooking mechanic from Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom into top-down Zelda in the form of smoothies. In a few spots around the world, you can find little stands manned by business scrubs. Here you can use 2 ingredients to make a smoothie. Now, like the meals in Breath of the Wild, these give you different effects based on what ingredients you use. Now, this idea worked very well in those 2 open world 3D games, but honestly, I just don't think it was that useful here. There are very few situations where the effects from the smoothies would actually be useful. I mostly just used them to refill my link meter, more on that later. Even climbing Heber Mountain, I just made an echo of a torch to keep myself warm. It almost feels like the whole smoothie system was added just as a way to tie this game to Breath of the Wild and not actually to help the player. The world design is honestly one of the coolest parts of this game. Looking at the map, it's very clear that this is meant to be an expanded version of the Hyrule from A Link to the Past. A lot of the major landmarks and overall geography line up very well, even if it's not perfect. Link's house is missing, and Kakariko Village is a little bit out of place, but it's basically the same. And I have to say, Nintendo and Grezzo really did a good job of maintaining this known world, while still incorporating the other races of Hyrule that weren't present in A Link to the Past. The settlements for the Gorons, Gerudos, Zora, and Deku Scrubs all fall outside the borders of the old map, and I thought this was a great way to handle having them while still remaining somewhat faithful to the original source material. They were always there, they were just outside the old map. The music was actually a high point of this game for me. Where in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, the music was fairly subdued and quiet, Echoes of Wisdom is a return to the epic, fun soundtracks of Zelda's past. Something Nintendo did to the music that I thought was pretty cool was that in areas that were established from other Zelda games like Kakariko Village, there were new themes. However, you could actually hear hints of the old tracks hidden in the new ones. Now, at first, I didn't like that Nintendo changed the well-known themes, but once I realized that the old themes were still hidden in there, I loved it. I especially loved the drums in Scrubton, reminding me of the Deku Palace in Majora's Mask. Of course, you can't have a Zelda game without some sort of dungeons, and this one is no exception. There are 6 main dungeons plus the final one, and I have to say, they're all actually pretty good here. Like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, Echoes of Wisdom does the dungeons a bit differently, as there are some quests that you have to complete just to reach the dungeons, and I love it. You generally have to help one of the races of Hyrule by getting rid of some smaller rifts, which usually helps solve some other problem they're having. And then you can enter the big rift in the area which contains the dungeon. I really like having the structure of having various goals and quests before each dungeon. It adds a lot to the experience of the game and allows for a lot more world building, which I always love. The dungeons themselves mostly focus on puzzle solving with a little bit of combat here or there. And while some of the puzzles are really simple, some of them actually take quite a bit of figuring. Like this one where you have to press both of these buttons at the same time. It took me so long to figure out that that's what you're supposed to do here. And a miracle actually happened with this game. I actually enjoyed the ice dungeon. I think this is the first time I've ever really enjoyed any sort of ice level in any game. Like Link's Awakening, Echoes of Wisdom has some side-scrolling sections, and now these aren't just limited to the dungeons, but that's mostly where they stick in my mind. But these sections are so much larger and more in-depth than in Link's Awakening. Like, there are actual puzzles, chests, and enemies here. It was really cool. To me, it almost seemed like Nintendo was trying to include some elements of Zelda 2, and I love it. Somewhat surprisingly, Nintendo kind of brought back dungeon items in this game. In a few of the dungeons, you have to fight an evil Echo of Link as a mid-dungeon boss, and yeah, Nintendo just added another canonical evil version of Link. When you defeat him, you get his sword, his bow, or his bombs. Now, the sword here is called the Might Sword, and when Zelda uses it, she temporarily transforms into Sword Fighter form, where she basically just becomes Link. You can jump higher, you can use a sword for fighting, and once you get them, you can use Link's bow and bombs. And this was really fun, but it takes away basically all of the challenge of combat. I guess that's why Nintendo put a time limit on how long you can stay in Sword Fighter form. That's what that Link meter I mentioned earlier was. I have some mixed feelings about the bosses of this game. Some of them aren't really that interesting or difficult, however, some of them are actually really fun. This game sees the return of Volvagia, which is actually a pretty good fight, and the Ganon battle was, for some reason, one of the hardest that I can remember. Like, seriously, I don't think I've ever had such a hard time with Dead Man's Volley before. Of course, the game can't be entirely puzzles and navigation. There has to be some combat, and I feel this is one of the few places where the game really falls short. The enemy variety is pretty good. There are a lot of different types of enemies, and some even have multiple levels. And actually, it's interesting, Moa's returned for the first time since Zelda 2. However, the fighting was actually pretty boring in general, and sometimes it just felt kinda clunky. Most of the time, it just meant creating echoes of a couple of spear moblins, standing back out of the way, and letting them fight. And half the times, the echoes would just miss the enemies that you're trying to attack. The combat was really only interactive when using Sword Fighter form, but with that, it was just way too easy. Now, of course, I understand that the game is supposed to be more about puzzles and figuring things out rather than fighting, but still, I wish Nintendo would have put a little more effort into making the combat fun. A big part of what makes Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom so fun in my opinion is the huge number of side quests you have. And thankfully, Nintendo incorporated the same sort of side quests here in Echoes of Wisdom. You get the same list in the pause menu as you get in Breath of the Wild, where you can see all of your active and completed main quests and side quests. And I like that they're all listed out with their descriptions like in the 3D games, as it makes it much easier to return to a side quest later after starting it. The quests themselves are generally pretty easy, and that's not really a problem. They're just meant as extra content, so they don't need to be hard. They just need to be fun. And they add enough content to keep the players engaged outside the main story. And besides keeping players playing, the side quests add a lot to the world building of the game, which I just love. Zelda games have always had fun mini-games, and Echoes of Wisdom is no exception. There are 4 here, although you could actually consider there to be 5. So the one minigame that I'd almost consider to be more of a side quest rather than a minigame is the Stamp Rally. Hidden around Hyrule are 25 stamp stations. When you find one, you get a stamp. This was set up by Stamp Guy, who is a cheerful little guy who loves stamps. Every 5 stamps you get a reward, and it is pretty fun to find these stations. My only real complaint is that I wish instead of creating a new character for this, Nintendo had decided to use Tingle. Like, seriously, Stamp Guy reminds me so much of Tingle that they probably could have just used him and it would have worked better. Anyway, seeing as that game is something that's drawn out over the course of your whole adventure, I'd almost consider that to be more of a side adventure rather than a minigame. Well, now for the actual minigames. First we have Mango Rush, where you need to spin to pick mangoes. If you don't pick them quickly enough, they'll wither and die. There are 3 difficulties, with each difficulty adding a hazard. First spiky plants, then bombs. It's not a hard game. Honestly, the hardest part was just my finger getting tired from pressing the spin button so quickly, but still it was pretty fun. Next up, acorn gathering. In a few spots around the world, you'll come across a guy wearing an acorn hat. He'll offer to let you play a game where you need to gather a bunch of acorns as fast as you can. And boy was this easy. The only slightly difficult part was avoiding the enemies in the area. In Kakariko Village, you can find the Slumber Dojo. This is where you can play a combat training minigame where you can go to sleep and dream of a fighting scenario. Sometimes you have no items or known echoes and just need to work with what you can find, and sometimes you can use anything you have except smoothies. Then there are a few scenarios which are boss rushes. Thanks to how useful Sword Fighter form is, the only battles that were really any sort of a challenge were the ones where you could only use what you found in the battle, the blank slate scenarios. And those were just annoyingly difficult. The last minigame was by far the most infuriating, the flag race. This is a horse race minigame where you need to touch all the flags around the track, and oh my goodness, this was awful. There are 3 different tracks, each with 2 times to beat, the clear time and the master time. Now, the clear times weren't really that hard, and on the middle and long track, it only took me a few tries to beat the master time. But the short track probably took me around 50 tries to beat the master time. Since the track was so short and there's really no places to cut time off, you just had to be perfect going around the corners and dashing. Like, seriously, it was so hard. I will say, I like that minigame used the horse race music from Ocarina of Time. I thought that was a really nice touch. At the end of the game, Zelda ventures through the Eternal Forest to find the Deku Tree. He's the guardian of the Prime Energy, the Triforce, which Zelda is trying to reach before an evil echo of herself gets it. When the echo touches the Triforce, it splits into 3. The echo gets the Triforce of Power, Zelda gets the Triforce of Wisdom, and the Triforce of Courage disappears into a rift, obviously seeking Link. Zelda follows the echo and defeats it, allowing her to finally free Link. However, the echo escapes and takes the Triforce of Power to null. So, Zelda returns Link's equipment, meaning you can no longer use the Sword Fighter form, and together they chase after the echo to recover the piece of the Triforce. Now this dungeon was actually great. You go through it with Link, fighting enemies together, but then you get separated. And this part was really cool. You and Link have to navigate the dungeon individually, but solving puzzles to help each other progress. I thought it was so much fun. Eventually, you both reach Null and have to do one of the most boring final bosses in the series. The first phase was really easy. Link attacked, and you just spawn echoes to attack with. I just made some pea hats and stood out of the way. The second phase was a bit more fun. You're swimming to follow Null, and you need to attack while swimming and dodging attacks. It wasn't really that hard, but it was pretty good, and it finally gave me a place to use the spiked roller echo. Then the third phase was basically the same as the first. The only real difference was that now Null was spawning echoes of some of the game's bosses to attack you, like 3 Ganons at once. But even with that, it really wasn't that hard. I just didn't care for the final boss as a whole. Since you gave Link a sword, there wasn't really a lot for you as the player to do. I basically just had to stay out of the way and respawn echoes as they were defeated. At the end of the fight, Null is damaged enough that the piece of the Triforce is exposed, so Zelda uses Bind to grab onto it and yank it free. Together, Link and Zelda use the Triforce to vanquish Null. Tri's task now being complete, they leave, which, while sad, it doesn't really have nearly the impact of the departure of other helper characters in the series, like Midna or even Navi. Back in Castletown, Link and Zelda joyfully reunite with their friends and family. And this ending kind of sucked. There was no interesting dialogue, and the camera just stayed completely stationary, zoomed in on the town. There really was nothing interesting about it, just sitting and watching everyone silently gesture at each other. The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom was overall a very good game. It took the known Zelda formula and merged it with the new formula set out by Breath of the Wild, and I think it works really well. However, it is definitely not perfect. I was honestly annoyed by some of the story choices they made, like, why rename the Triforce? It has literally been called the Triforce since the original Legend of Zelda. The only slight exception might be considered in the Minish Cap, where there's the Light Force, but that's supposed to be a different thing separate from the Triforce. And what's the deal with Null? According to this game, Null was around before the Golden Goddesses created the world, and they made the world to contain him. But the game also says that Null has always created these rifts, and that the Tri created to seal the rifts. But if that's the case, why have we never seen one of these rifts before in the series? And this game implies that Null is the ultimate source of all evil in Hyrule. But it had already been established that Demise was the source of all evil in Hyrule. So, are Demise and Null supposed to be the same character? Was Demise made by Null? Is Demise maybe even Echo? I have a feeling that Nintendo's never going to follow up on that, so we may never know. Despite my issues with the story, I really did enjoy this game. The dungeons were pretty good, with some really challenging puzzles, and the side quests allowed for a level of world building we never really experienced with 2D Zelda before. One thing I'm really hoping for is that Nintendo gives us a prequel to this game with Link's adventure before he gets captured, because it's implied that he goes on a whole big adventure up to the point where he gets captured after defeating Ganon. So I would love if the next Zelda game we got was that adventure. That'd be really cool. Regardless of my issues with this game, I feel that the hype it got leading up to release was really well deserved, and it leaves me feeling really hopeful for 2D Zelda going forward. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and consider subscribing. What were your thoughts on Echoes of Wisdom? Did you enjoy the puzzle solving like I did? And did you think the clunky combat detracted from the experience at all? Please let me know what you think down in the comments. Well, until next time, so long.